right here of Eric Canete.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Eric Canete is a conceptual artist, comic book illustrator, and a storyboard artist. He has worked in comics from Iron Man, Enter the Mandarin, and Run Love Kill, to name a few. In animation, started by being part of the team that brought the legendary Aeon Flux at MTV. On recent times, he has been involved in projects like Ben 10, Alien Force for Cartoon Network, Justice League Unlimited, and Beware the Batman with Warner Brothers Animation, and Tron Uprising for Disney. And even he has worked on video games like Killer Instinct for Microsoft and League of Legends at Riot Games. He's currently working on Arc Athena, his covering creator-owned comic book miniseries, which will be crowdfunding by Indiegogo to be launched in September 15th. Today, we are here to explore how he mixes these two worlds, storyboard and comics, along with his dynamic storytelling and his signature art style.
You are like kind of the missing link between these two worlds, that is animation and comic books. But you really started from a storyboard, right?
Yeah, well, my background is animation. I wanted to get into comics for a very long time, and fortunately, it was very difficult to get in that era of comics because stylistically, the work that I was doing didn't match what was very popular or marketable in the comic book industry. So instead, I was lucky enough to be I got a job on Aeon Flux as an environment designer first. And eventually, I garnered enough trust from the series creator and the director himself, Peter Chung, that when the schedule fell behind schedule, when they fell behind schedule for one of the episodes, Peter trained me and took a chance on me and told me, basically taught me a lot of different things from the storyboarding aspect. So I learned a lot from him.
When was like the link between the storyboard and the comic books? Comic books, you already love comic books from the start?
No, I loved comics. I mean, from the very beginning, I really wanted to draw a lot of mainstream superhero comics. Again, my style wasn't very good for it because comics had to look a very specific way for Marvel or DC. I understand that it's part of the business. So, but it started, I would say, I'm an old guy. So like 1993, I started wanting to work in the comic book industry professionally and graduated from high school. And it wasn't too long before I started working in the animation industry. But the style that I was using back then, again, wasn't very marketable. I didn't land on the style that I'm using now until years later when I worked for Warner Brothers Animation, working on, Teen Titans and Justice League Unlimited, the Batman for Warner Brothers. So once I started storyboarding, I realized, there's something here that was not in my work in the past, which is more cinematic composition, more, and also my style loosened up a lot so that I can be faster drawing comics, because in animation, you have to draw so many storyboards at any given time for one episode. Imagine an episode is about 21 minutes long because of a commercial, so that's about 3 acts. Those 3 acts are given out to 3 different storyboard artists, and you have about 4 weeks. You start on week 1 doing roughs with you're doing roughs for about maybe 2 weeks or so, maybe a week and a half or so. You check in with the director. He takes a look at your roughs and maybe makes adjustments. And then finally, on the second week, you show your full roughs. And from there, they start making notes. And then, you incorporate those notes in the last 2 weeks. You turn that in and you start on the very next episode again. So it's an assembly line process, but it trains you to, number one, be fast about your drawing. But more importantly, it trains you, because things can change all the time, right? So it trains you not to fall in love with a shot, which is something that I, as an artist, I really like. Oh, I really love that shot in comics. In animation, there's no room for that. So you really have to go, I like the shot. You have to be able to explain it to your director. And if he thinks of something, I understand what you're trying to go for, but I think we can get this shot better if we can get the emotion of this shot better if we go like this. So that's why I really have a tendency to just get over falling in love with certain shots in my comics now.
One thing I have noticed on your style is that you always take absolutely advantage of the way that you deform and make spaces and the composition not really symmetrical, because
Mm.
I think the 90% of the people that I see his artwork is always symmetrical, or is like the kind of same layout. So is there
Yeah.
some influence there about from animation and comics in a mix as well, or is more like
Yeah, I don't know if it's a conscious effort to try to make things different, but in animation, and like, animation is closely related to cinema, as you know, and every shot needs to communicate something because you only have so much time to spend. Every shot is very expensive to animate. So the idea is that when you pick a shot, it should speak to the narrative, whether it's context, the context is easy, which is two guys fighting or two guys, drinking in a bar or whatever it is. But sometimes a shot is about subtext, the mise en scène, which is what do these two characters in relation to each other, which one is the dominant one and which one is the submissive one. Those kinds of things help inform the shots that I take over into comic books. That's all cinematic, that's all storyboarding.
what is like the process that you have taken from the storyboard learning to comic books specifically?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's understanding. I think one of the things that I used to do in comics, and I had this great opportunity to draw comics professionally, and then went back into storyboarding again and learned so many things from a friend and mentor of mine, a guy by the name of Jay Oliva. In 2000, I think it was in the mid 2000s when they relaunched the He-Man cartoon. He taught me a lot about action sequences and fight choreography. Peter Chung taught me a lot about picking a really interesting shot. Sam Liu is a good friend of mine, but has been my director for years. He's the one that really took those two components, action, choreography, and coming up with an interesting shot and composition. And he took those two elements and really helped me hone it to how to help best serve the narrative. One of the things that I'd come to pick up is if you have to make sure that the intent or the reader is very clear on the intent of the shot, right? Sometimes people have a tendency, especially in comics, where they don't necessarily have an understanding of continuity of shots. So when you look at comics, because you're intaking all you're sort of like intaking the experience all in one page, you kind of the information is delivered to you in such a way that you don't have to wait for the next shot. But in the comics that I try to draw, each shot should feel organic and natural, as if you're focusing on one panel at a time, so that when you see the next panel afterwards, you go, oh, that feels very natural, that feels very organic. And those are the kinds of things that I always challenge myself on. There's some pages that I'm working on that two characters are being told a surprise is coming around the corner, and when they turn to look at what that surprise is, you see what their surprise is. A lot of comics don't understand that kind of beat, that kind of like emotional or psychological rhythm. And that's one of the big things that I took from animation to comics.
Also the big difference between those two is actually the format of how you can consume a sequence, right? Because
For sure.
In comic books, it's like always taking care of the next page and revealing, revealing, and
Yeah.
become pretty repetitive in some way.
It really is. It really is. It's the comic book reader, an experienced comic book reader has come to get used to the cadence that you're talking about, which is, oh, do the surprise on the page after. To be honest with you, I don't really care, right? Like that's not my storytelling style. I remember when I was working with Mark Millar on Chrononauts 2, and one of the challenges that I put in front of myself, because I knew Millar's relationship with Netflix, and I knew these was one of the books that they were going to be looking at as a potential property in which they can turn into a series. I knew that, but also I wanted to challenge myself to not break the panels that many times. So on the page, similar to like Run, Love, Kill, everything was very semantic. Everything was 16 by 9, if not wider. That's how I tell my story. Now I know in comics there's a psychology behind that too, where it's like, you pace it so that the big reveal is in the opposite page. I rarely take advantage of that psychology.
And so now you're working on a new project, and it's called Arc Athena.
Yep, it's a creator-owned project. It's a six-issue miniseries. I'm crowdfunding. I'm going to be doing a crowdfunding campaign for each and every single one of them. The first one launches on the the 15th of September on Indiegogo. If you'd like to know more information about it, you can go to my website, ericcanete.com. There will be a pop-up there that will allow you to sign up for a newsletter. Inside that newsletter will be a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, as well as when each campaign goes live. It's been incredibly humbling, but also very informative, because I've never had to do this stuff from the very beginning on my own. Well, I have the help of a lot of different people, you included, Leo, that help me along with the production, because I'm learning. There's a lot of things that I don't know, and as I learn, I'm getting more and more confident as I go about it.
And what is the stuff that you put in this series different from other series that you have drawn?
Like I said earlier, it's funny that you mentioned that, because earlier I mentioned how with Mark Millar and in Run, Love, Kill, I was very bound to, presenting everything in that 16 by 9, if not wider, widescreen shot, right? Arc Athena is taking advantage of the comic book format, right? And I think it's because I am actively recalling the comics that I grew up with in the mid-90s, if not earlier, in X-Men and Wildcats and Image and stuff like that, where it's big action sequences. And I think if comics is good for something, it's those big, amazing, bombastic scenes where it makes you go like, oh my gosh, look how cool that is, By putting myself in that widescreen limitation, it was rare that I could give you that big shot, right? But with Arc Athena, I'm actually taking advantage of the comic book format by breaking panels, huge splash pages, huge double page spreads. I'm really, by way of color, I'm really infusing it with as much, with like, I think pretty decent levels of saturation, which I think have become, MIA in modern comics. Everything has a really toned down palette, even though they're doing superhero things, So I like having that saturation in this book. And I looked for that saturation in this book, and thankfully we were able to come up with a pretty legible version of it, because you can oversaturate, right?
Yeah, tell it to me. Can you show us some of the stuff that you have over there of related to storyboarding or comic books?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I can show you a couple of storyboards that I worked for Disney, and that was an incredible experience, because I worked with what I would say I can only classify it to be one of the luckiest experiences that I've ever worked on. I was brought on by the series supervising director and producer Charlie Bean, who has gone on to do so many different stuff for Warner Brothers, so many different things in the entertainment industry when it comes to animation. But the first time I met Charlie, he had assembled for himself a very top-notch, we're talking, I can't remember the last time that I was on a team this strong when it came to animation, but he had Alberto Mielgo as the lead environment artist and art director. He had Robert Valley as a head character designer, as well as a storyboard artist and a director. He had June On, it was one of June's very first jobs in the industry, and he was working right next to Alberto, so he knew what a challenge it was for him to meet that expectation. And because these were entertainment industry guys, they tapped the shoulders of a lot of different guys that they worked with in the past, from Rob Rupel to Craig Mullins, a lot of guys who are working in the concept art industry for feature film. They were doing environment designs for Tron, and I think that's why it looked as pretty as it did. So when Charlie asked me to come on board to help storyboard for the show, I knew that I needed to bring as much of my passion and as much of my attention, my concentration as possible. The first storyboard that I ever did for them, it was the first show that I ever worked on where they went completely digital in their production pipeline. But I hadn't gotten used to the program that they were using at that point. I think it was Toon Boom Storyboard Pro, and it didn't feel very good to me. I still wanted to work traditionally, and I remember my very first storyboard for Tron, because I wanted to be so comprehensive. I wanted to be so pretty, because again, the company that I was keeping was pretty A-list. I rendered everything in Copic marker, but it ended up being like 400 or 500 page, three panel storyboards long. And somebody on the production, that was their job to scan all of my art and get it ready for and mounted it into the editing bay so that they can start editing it. And I was pretty embarrassed that I didn't start doing digital storyboards until much, much later. But on Tron, I think was the last time I did storyboards traditionally. I can share that with you now. And these are much smaller because I realized I was spending so much time rendering that I was burning through the majority of my schedule. And the thing about that is that Tron was a very it was a pretty open schedule when it came to by animation industry standards. I had 8 weeks to storyboard one episode of Tron, whereas elsewhere you would only barely have 4 weeks. So it was a really, really open schedule. But even with that open schedule, I was already I was burning through so much time because I was rendering everything with markers. So I didn't want if you recognize how almost pictographic some of these drawings are, it's because they're very, very small. The originals were very, very small on storyboard paper. But ultimately, and I think this is something that I learned on Tron, right? Like ultimately, if a shot is good, right? If you make a shot legible, it forced me to become simpler with my lines. It forced me to become like, what is the most essential that I can draw? You know.
Yeah, in fact, this is very. I think this, this way of making it is like, when I make design as well. I try to be iconic.
Yes.
That's the word, because the idea is that the eye can really see it in a glimpse and recognize what is happening in that shot, especially the one that you're showing that is a fast sequence. You have to make people to really understand it, even if it's a faster thing.
Yeah, and
it's
yeah,
iconic.
absolutely. And the thing about storyboarding is it's not about ultimately, I mean, the drawing needs to be good because obviously it needs to be legible and it needs to be on model to the show, right? Sometimes if you draw something like Tron's proportions, they were very tall and thin people. And if you draw them looking normal, right, sometimes the composition of the shot on the screen in the final product gets thrown off because the ratio is off, right? Where they are in the composition. So drawing needs to be good, but it doesn't necessarily need to be like super pretty. It just needs to communicate all the right information on the screen, all the right information of acting, and that's a big thing. That's another thing that I brought from animation into story and into comics is I became really aware of how impactful good acting is in doing storyboards. There, I worked with a storyboard artist who's now, I think, an executive producer, if not became a director, now an executive producer over there at Netflix. Her name is Lauren Montgomery. And Lauren was really, really good at acting. She got really sick of it because, I mean, she was so good of it, she got sick of the assignments that she would get because anytime that there was an acting scene in the Justice League and, the shows that we'd work on, it'd always end up going to her. And she knew she wanted to get better at action. So, but she was so good at it that it was natural just to give it to her. But it was from her that I learned how important a good acting scene is. It's easy to, I mean, it's funny to say, but it's really easy to do action, but to have characters emote the right sort of feeling so that the audience can really understand, oh, this character is going through some really heavy decision making, or this couple is really in love, and it has a lot to do with composition and drawing it well. I didn't really have an appreciation for that before I started doing storyboards. Once I left storyboards and brought it to and back into comics, when I started doing my comic book work, and especially now that I'm working on Arcathena, I'm very aware of exactly what the emotion is, even if it's just an action, But most importantly, when I'm doing scenes where people are talking with each other in comics, there's very I don't know why, but people don't really spend enough time, or they devalue a talking scene because they just want to get through it to get through like all the cool stuff, like all the guys fighting each other or running through the street or driving a fast car or all those cool kind of things. But I think to understand character, you really have to, be clear and be aware of what the script is saying. Understand the subtext of the script, if not obviously you're getting the context of the script, but if you understand the subtext of the script, what are they really talking about, and how do I pick the shots and the poses and the and the emotion that they're going through, so that I really help the narrative of this script. And I got all of that in my experience in animation. I always try to bring.
And how do you do like you saying, like trying to express these characters? Obviously, some of that stuff comes from your experience as a human and interacting
Yeah,
with other
sure,
humans.
for
But
sure.
I
Yeah.
suppose you also watch on movies or certain other references.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a perfect question. So sometimes my wife is a brilliant, she's a much better storyboard artist than I am, right? And we talk about this all the time. And we have these moments when we're watching movies where a scene will happen and it's really emotionally impactful, right? And we
Mhm.
take a look at that scene, and sometimes it really is it interrupts the movie because we go like, "Whoa, that was really strong," right? And so we stop, right, and we rewind, we scrub through the scene that we just saw, and we ask why. Obviously what they're talking about is strong, but what did the director and the cinematographer do in that shot to really help what the conversation or the dialogue is about? And so now we're paying attention. It's like movies are very manipulative. I'm working with somebody now. She was talking to me, and she's like, Eric, ever since we started talking about composition and storyboarding and acting, I'm watching all of these movies, and I go, wow, movies are really manipulative. And I said, yeah, that's their job. Like a good cinematographer, a good director, and a good storyboard artist can pull that emotion from you, and you don't even have to have music playing.
No,
Look at some.
tell it to landing in the moon.
Yeah, sure. Sure, right? Like take the music away from any one of your favorite movies where there's an emotional scene, and even without music, especially because if there's top-notch actors doing their acting, right? And especially with the composition, all of those things need to come into place. But if it's done well, man, it's really good. And that has a lot to do with what the director and the cinematographer is doing. They're helping the actors really land that scene. So that's one of the things. I watch a lot of movies, or at least I used to. I used to watch a lot of movies and go like, why does that shot work? How can I? And then you start build. I started building up the mental Rolodex of shots. So I sometimes it's something completely different. I'll see a scene in a script that I have, and I go like, oh, that kind of reminds me of this thing from this movie that I watch. I'll watch the movie and I'm like, oh, I can't use that thing shot for shot, but I understand how they constructed these scenes so that you'll feel what they're feeling, or like, oh, you understand why it's so important emotionally to land that shot. So there you go.
Yeah, the only thing missing from obviously the storyboards and comic books is when you have certain times when you cut the scene, right?
Yeah.
In when you see in a movie, you really also the timing is very important. How do you
Yes.
establish timing in some way on storyboard and different to comic books?
Well, like you just answered the storyboard part. The storyboard is, doing animation, doing moving pictures, you control timing, right? You have absolute control of when to reveal information because it's, 24 frames per second, like shot for shot. You get to tell the audience. It's a very passive, from an audience perspective, it's a very passive experience. They're waiting for you to tell them the information that you want them to know. Doesn't make it any less manipulative, actually makes it more manipulative,
It
right?
is.
In comics, you have to pace out the shot, and you and I were talking about this offline before you started recording. You have to pace out. There's mechanisms in comics that allow you to help heavy emotional, and I just don't mean emotional like crying. I mean emotional as in like a heightened emotion like action, a similar one with crying and sadness, but definitely something that's the most impactful. You save that for the mechanism in comics is turning the page, right? I told you I'm guilty of not paying attention to any of that stuff. But there's things in comics that you can do it. How do you slow things down? There's formulas that people have tried. It's kind of I don't know if it works all the time. Sometimes they say like, oh, in order to slow things down in comics, you put more panels. And I
Yeah.
go like, okay, but that's not always true. It's a good idea, but it's not always true. For me, in order to slow down a page, I'm very deliberate about where I pull your eye, right? I'm very deliberate about how my compositions work with each other so that you are compelled to slow down just enough to look. So you know, a linear composition allows you to get through the page very, very quickly, right? A more complex composition, the one that makes you, the composition of panels in context to each other, if I have to look at a panel and then have to look over to the side to see what the next panel looks like, that is enough of a slowdown. It's not much, but it's better than making everything go straight up and down where a guy can go like, oh, I get the information, I'm moving on to the next one, right? It's literally a mechanism, a physical one, if not a mental one, to slow down the audience to find the next piece of information that they need. Now, what screws me up a lot is that I don't make that concept known to the letterer. And so the letterer puts something in place where I go like, oh, that's not ideal. I know that's the blank area that naturally you want to put that information in, but that blank area is there for a reason. So yeah. I need you to move the bubble over here instead. So it really is like a very coordinated coordinated concert, between all the creatives involved in comics to make sure, to answer your question, to make sure there's that pace that you intend.
Because storyboards, I think in some way you have the same box, right? But yep. Like you say, comic books really show the layout of it. It gives Absolutely. You another sense. It's kind of a collage that happens, like a scrapbook that in place of just showing information in a text is showing context all the time, so you get the mood really from a movie. That's yeah. Why when they say they try to adapt a comic book to a movie, I think what people, the guys who really got into comic books, they are not very interested in a movie when they adapt something that is very difficult to translate, like Watchmen. I think Watchmen was like, when you see the movie, I still know people that they say they didn't make accurate to the comic book, But what really makes a story is the format, or is the story by itself?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you using your example of the Watchmen, right? What's difficult to land universally, almost impossible, is the personal experience, right? When the director reads that comic and they are now going to translate into film, especially one that is as legendary as Watchmen is, each person that you read it, if you read Watchmen and I read Watchmen and you and I end up talking about it, we'll have very unique experiences. That's to you, to me. Now you're taking this director that has his unique experience with this property, and when people watch it, it's almost like saying, wait a minute, that's not what's in my head. There's no way for him to do that, right? That's his movie. I think what often, especially in those adaptations from comic book to film, is, are they capturing the spirit of what the original comic's intent was? And if the answer is yes, then you give them a little bit more room as a creative, as an artist, to interpret the spirit of that into moving pictures, because he's not making a comic book reproduction. He's not saying like, oh, I'm going to redraw Watchmen, or I'm going to draw Watchmen again. Then you go like, well, that doesn't make any sense. He's making a feature film, so he's leveraging moving pictures, but it's not going to be exactly what you had in your head, just as long as he captures the spirit. That's for me, that's the metric. From like, oh yeah, I know where the source material, From Hell was a perfect example, right? Like that used to be a comic book that got turned into a feature film. Like, I think they were pretty close to the brothers that directed that movie. I think they were pretty close to their interpretation of what the book was. V for Vendetta.
Yeah, I even feel like Scott Pilgrim as well has like the flavor.
For absolutely. But you know what I mean? Like that's a perfect example of like there was no way they're going to be able to 100% capture what was in the comic, but as long as you have an understanding of the jokes, the intent of the author, and in this case it was actually great because the author was heavily involved, right?
Also, that Edward Wright was directing his style by itself of storytelling.
Yes, yeah,
it fits with the actual tone. It's not the same way that O'Malley writes, but I think it fits the tone of how you present, like you say.
I agree.
Stuff. right?
I agree. Yeah, there's another movie, and people don't know that this is adapted from a comic. This is a movie with Tom Hanks called Road to Perdition. And you're like, oh yeah, I can see it. You know, you were talking about tone right now. That director perfectly captured the tone of that comic interpreted onto the screen. So, you know, Sin City is another one. Robert Rodriguez did Sin City, and you're like, yeah, he understood what Sin City was about. You know.
Who is the director that you will want for Arcatini adaptation to movie?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I haven't thought of it. You and I offline laughed that Arcathena is like a like a bastard child of Michael Bay and Steven Spielberg slammed together all at the same time. You know, we like Arcathena in its presentation and its bombastic nature is unapologetic about where its source material comes from, right? It's like, you know, that era of comics when superheroes looked a very specific way. So I'm very, very proud of the execution of that. But if you were to ask me, oh, who do you have in mind for who would direct it? I'm like, it's got to be some guy who has an appreciation and understanding of that spirit of that, you know. And the first one that the first one that you and I laugh at is just like, oh, it's Michael Bay, because again, it's so. And I know people will laugh and be like, oh, Michael Bay, blah blah blah, but you know, because I think it's because he knows how to, you know, capture the. I think he knows how to play up how big something is. Sometimes, you know, yeah, the story might not be as good, right? It's very summer blockbuster movie, right? We understand. Like at the very least, when you see a Michael Bay movie, right, you know that it's a Michael Bay movie, or it's a guy trying to copy a Michael Bay movie, right?
Copycat.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so if you were to ask me, just as a you know, tongue in cheek and a wink and a nod, I'd say like Michael Bay, because that makes
well. The advantage for Michael Bay is because usually their movies has a lot of budget, and that's really good for this comic, because you know, I have seen the comic and it's like a lot of happening stuff every day.
Yeah.
So I just try to imagine how this fits into an actual movie, and I don't even think that half of the comic can be 2 hours long. You know, like it's
Yeah.
because
Yeah,
it's
it's you know, again, it starts off small enough, and by the time we get to issue 3, like I said, it's really unapologetic about how big it gets, you know. And the thing is, you know, the funny story is that, you know, when you're talking about it to friends, when you and I are talking about the story, when you and I'm talking to other people about the ideas, they're like, that's awesome. And then I have to go freaking draw it now, you know, like, what does that composition look like to make you help best understand what's going on, you know?
Okay, so you're gonna show us some stuff.
Yeah, I'll show black and white for, I don't know what issue this is. I think this is issue 4, issue 3. So
Wow,
it's not even,
it's an exclusive.
It's not
You
even.
come from the future.
Yeah. You guys are seeing it from the future. We won't go through all of it, but for your audience, for the people watching at home.
Wow, man, this is so. You don't get lost drawing all of this.
No, I think like the thing is, everything is always story centric, right? And God bless my colorist for trying to find a way to make this all work. But I think I really have an opportunity here to first of all, because again, with the previous projects that I worked on, it was really working with an author, working with a writer. Not what do you call it? Run Low Kill was a little bit more my own. You're right. I was involved in the narrative, but not necessarily in the writing. But this one's 100% me, and this this is an opportunity to really kind of, you know, stretch my legs and say I've wanted to draw this forever, you know. And I want to be able to draw a scene like this that I remember from X-Men back in the day, or like an old school 90s comic. I've always wanted to draw a version of that, you know? And so this is what I mean when I was talking to you about like composing a scene almost cinematically, because if you have an understanding of context and subtext, you know, these are two leaders of the team that have two very different approaches to leadership. And even in their coping mechanism, they approach it very differently from each other, you know. I love this scene because this is when they come to realize they have different approaches, but the same end goal.
Okay.
And one of the main characters, the girl in the middle panel on the left there, you come to realize she's really for the duration, for the first X amount of issues of the series, she has really been personally not actively stopping herself from living up to her potential as a true leader, because she got too caught up in all of the unnecessary things out there, including not limited to, but including like public attention and acceptance and all that kind of stuff, rather than performing the way she needs to in order to help her team succeed.
How,
So
how
this
do you
that
how do you make like all this sequence that you have shown? When do you decide when you are gonna break like the panel or composite the panel? How do you what are like your priorities when you do that type of stuff and doesn't show like too much, or that is breaking something that is doesn't.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this one's pretty easy. There's a
Yeah, that
scene in there's a scene in what do you call? There's a scene in Heat, and I keep referring to this scene
Oh.
as a perfect Michael Mann scene, And they have this scene in Heat where they meet at the coffee shop for the very first time, right? But previous to give it context, there's Robert De Niro's character is a thief. He's trying to break into a local bank, but in order to do it, he needs to do research on the kind of metals that the safe for this bank has, right? What its weakness is, all the other things, substructure stuff that he needs to understand because he's going to break into it. Inside that bookstore is a young lady by the name of Edie, right? So Edie sees him in that store, and later on they run into each other in the coffee shop. So she sits next to him, and she's trying to connect with him, right? Because she's new in town. She doesn't have that many friends. And she saw him earlier. She just tries to start a conversation. And the position of that camera versus how Robert De Niro's character, this guy named Neil, is acting, the way Michael Mann shot it is amazing. Everything is closed off. Everything is, why are you paying attention to me? Why are you asking me all sorts of questions? Until and then he gets to the point where he's annoyed with her because she's trying too hard to become friendly with him. And he says, "Why do you want to know my business?" And she's like, "I'm sorry, I just saw you at the bookstore. I thought, I'm new in town. I wanted to be friends." And then he realizes, oh, if she's genuine, she's not trying to, he's paranoid because he's a thief, right? But she's genuine. She's not trying to take advantage of me. And at a certain time, the camera breaks the 180, right? And it just crosses over the bar. And suddenly, Robert De Niro's body is, because just the position of the camera, is turned towards her now, as opposed to being away from her. And he becomes softer, he becomes more communicative, he becomes like engaging, he starts talking to her more. And to me, that is the goal. That is sort of like the golden standard. Like if I can come up with a scene and by which we start off shot for shot, and because you understand, through the dialogue, you understand the context. Oh, these two people are meeting. They have a different, in the previous scene to this one in issue 1, this is actually a flashback after issue 1. There was a physical altercation between those two characters, and the guy and the gentleman here, the guy with the robot or the robot face, comes to apologize to her for what that physical altercation took part. And it starts off incredibly awkward. It's not, "I'm sorry" is not a very good, it's not very natural thing for them to say. So I start them off really far apart from each other, like in this middle scene. Really far apart from each other. And she approaches this conversation very weird, in a sense that she understands that it was through her limitations that there was a huge accident in the very, very beginning. And he understands that he needs to be there to apologize, but also needs to wait his turn so that she can be calm enough for that apology, Okay. So these kinds of shots, especially when it comes to like not breaking the 180, this was such a difficult scene to set up, because if you look, I establish that he's always on the left-hand side of the panel,
Yeah.
Always on the left-hand side of the panel. Every time you see a composition between the two of them, he's on the left, she's on the right, right? And because I want the reader to always have that appreciation of like two people back and forth, But as I start going through the scene and he's about to leave, suddenly I get closer and closer in the shot, right? Because I want those things, the connection between them, to be that much more intimate. This is when you realize, oh, she's not the dummy that we've come to learn about her through the series so far. She's actually very, very smart. It's just the position that she's been put in. She's not allowed, she's not, either not allowed herself to, or there are people in place, the people who think of her very one way very specifically, have not allowed her to excel in that leadership space. And so by the time we cut back out of that flashback, and now we just see a bunch of fucking Michael Bay. Michael Bay.
Yeah. Cut it. Let's go to it. All right.
Yeah. But I wanted to have those moments in this book because, in as far as, you know, drawing at big action sequences, and I've seen it a lot. There's a lot of I've seen a lot of comic books that really excel at drawing big fight scenes, drawing, you know, giant scenes of destruction, right? Like, but what they don't seem to have an understanding for is how important it is for you to connect with these characters, so that when they are put into danger, it immediately feels immediate, right? It feels like critical, right? It feels like somebody could genuinely get hurt right now, and I care for them. And like, you don't even necessarily need to, like, you know, I'm not a big fan of like, oh, you need to make your characters relatable. I'm not a fan of like, I don't know what that guy does. Like, the guy fights giant robots. I don't know how we relate to that, you know? Rather, I think of things as like, I want those characters to be understandable, even though you don't walk in the same shoes as they do, even though they're the different gender, even though they're like, but you understand what's motivating them. You understand what's driving them to excel, or why they're failing the way they do. And I think that level, that kind of understanding gives you insight, and more importantly, like, it allows you to like, oh, that's why they made the decisions that they did, you know?
Yeah, I cannot get relatable relatable to your art, because I never see myself in 100 years drawing this. This is it's absolutely crazy, man. It's like how much time it takes you like doing all these pages, you know, like because I know that you're working really hard on the mornings, and then has certain amount of time just for this, you know, like then you have your Clark Kent's job.
Yes, my regular job.
And then you have this. So how much time you can give to this project on a daily basis?
It all depends, really, but at minimum, in order for me to maintain the pace and output that I need in order to make this series come out at a certain time, because unlike other crowdfunding series, to give you context, or to give you perspective, most crowdfunding series, they do one and done, and then like they work another X amount long, and then the next one comes out maybe 8 months later or so on, right? Arc Athena comes out every 4 months, right? So in order to maintain that cadence of delivery, I really wanted to get as much of the series done, the 6 issues done as possible before I launch on September 15th, right? So I needed to have easily 4 pages a week done, maybe as many as 5, depending on the extra side thing. So I don't know what that is in hours. I'm up at a quarter after 4 in the morning, right? 4 a.m. I'm up. I get my breakfast. I eat it as quickly as possible. I check my emails, whatever it is. I draw as many of these pages as I can, and I have to do family time starting 8 o'clock, 8:30. So about 4 hours to draw a page, you know?
Wow.
And I think, and I told you, and I said this earlier, you know, storyboarding really helps with that, because it allows you to concentrate on what is the most critical, the most essential piece of information that I need to draw to communicate this thing, the information that's on the script, right? And sometimes it's like insane panels like this, but because this is what it's, these panels are obviously, you know, take longer, you know, this double page spread obviously takes longer, but this is what I needed in order to communicate this action scene, right? But there are some scenes that take shorter, because that's all the lines that I need, that's all the drawing that's necessary, you know? So but this was a stupid issue, because in the beginning I wanted it to be an all pinup issue, you know, like, because I wanted that big, we're talking about Michael Bay 90s comics, explosive, and I said like, oh, I can't tell a story in pinups. It's too difficult. I don't know how to do it. So I conceded that you know 30%, 33% of the issue was pinups like this one, like splash pages.
Yeah, it's Yeah, it's like you are stuck with your little storyboarder inside of you, telling, "I need more panels. I need to tell this story." You
Yeah, well,
know?
you want to tell the story well, right? And the
Yeah.
last thing that I'd ever want to do is as an audience, as a reader, lose you. That's like one of my big no-nos is if as a reader one of the things is like you're reading the script or you're reading the dialogue on the page, but the drawings don't match the intensity or the intent of the dialogue. Or, if you're just looking at the page and you're just like carefully scanning through it or whatever, and you don't know what the heck is happening. That's my nightmare. That's a poor storytelling job if you can't tell what's going on the page. So I always try to do my best. And sometimes, like, to your point, like you're joking, but it's absolutely true. Where I'm like, I need to put an extra page in here.
Perfect, my friends. I think we getting into the end of this. So
Yeah.
just before we go, as a classic, what do you recommend to people that are working in comics and working on a storyboard that they can approach to each one, right? Because I sometimes see that comic book guys are like not very relatable to this, and at the same time, the storyboarders is like, no, I'm not gonna try comic books because it's very complex. But
Yeah.
you are in the middle. What do you recommend? Like a hint that says, "Hey, I think you need to check this out."
If it comes to like books, there's two books out there that I just recently found again, and I had to buy them again. There's a book called Framed Ink 1 and 2, right? That guy comes from a very cinematic background when it comes to it's Marcos Mateo, and he does a bunch of storyboards for film, for television, but he also has a great explanation in that book of why shot compositions can be translated very almost one to one into comics, right? The thoughts behind a shot in film as it's translated onto the page, like the ones that I just showed you. He walks you through his theories, and it's very comprehensive. So that's well worth.
So thank you, Eric Canete, for being here with us. We hope we have give you an insight in the missing link between storyboard and comic books. Thanks to Pixelatl for inviting us to be part of this year's festival.
So happy birthday.
Thanks to Jose Iniesta, Christian Bermejo,